Big Brother, mainstream media, government cover-ups. You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network. And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex Jones.
Hello on this Friday, 6/21. This is David Knight, and we are here live in Austin, but Alex Jones is not here. Actually, Alex is working on the next big blockbuster, the next installment of the Obama deception. You know, it's very important, these documentaries. People ask why we cover Hollywood, why we review films, why we do documentaries. In a documentary, you can lay out the facts in a way that you just don't have time to cover it on the news. So we can cover what's happening, and it's important that you know what's going on, keep your ear to the ground, and keep informed. But when you really want to understand what's behind the news, when you really want to get the broader and deeper picture, nothing does that like a documentary. So we're all about documentaries here. As a matter of fact, we've got an exclusive on State of Mind, which is a new documentary coming out from the people that brought us the Noble Lie, which was a expose of the Oklahoma City bombing. State of Mind, the psychology of mind control. And if you pre-book that right now, you get a free copy of The American Dream. It's a great cartoon version that explains what's going on with our banking system, how we got into this mess, follows the money trail. It does it in a very fun, very informative way for people. It's a great way to wake people up. But, you know, the mind control thing is also very important. It's important for people to understand that this is something that is not just tinfoil hat conspiracy stuff. This is something that's been going on for a long time. It's been discussed. It's been released in classified documents that have been declassified. The government's been working on this since the 50s at least. And this is something that is in our second hour. We're going to have on the show Dr. William Pepper, and he is actually defending Sirhan Sirhan. You might think that's an open and shut case. Actually, it isn't. There's some new evidence that was brought to light by some advances in technology. In 2004, they discovered an audio recording that had not really been analyzed before, and they didn't really have the technology to analyze it before 2004. But with this new technology, with this new recording, they heard that there were not just 8 gunshots, that is what could be held from Sirhan Sirhan's gun, but actually 13. And so we're going to be talking to Dr. Pepper, and he was also involved in a trial of James Earl Ray, the accused assassin of Martin Luther King. And he never had a trial because he confessed. Seems like they always manage to get people to have a confession, plea bargain them down to a life in prison or something like that. So they don't have to have a trial, so there's no discovery or discussion of the evidence. And that's what happened in James Earl Ray's case. And he never had a trial, but this was the trial that he never had, and it was done as a television trial with Dr. Pepper, and the King family wanted to have this trial done, and we'll be talking to him about the revelations of that. We've also got Paul Joseph Watson coming up in the third hour, and we're going to be talking about this breaking case of Michael Hastings in L.A., and it has all the hallmarks, in my opinion, of a bomb and not a simple car accident. It just doesn't look like any kind of car accident, any kind of fiery crashes are very rare. You typically don't see the engine ejected at a 90-degree angle. There's a picture of it up there on the screen. You don't see the kind of damage to the front end that's going to cause the fire to start. Fires in cars that are fatal typically happen because someone crashes it into a wall and gets pinned into it, and the engine catches fire. Well, the engine was ejected. There wasn't that much damage done to the front end, and the engine was ejected at kind of a 90-degree angle from where they were. That's not typical in crashes, and it's not typical of a new Mercedes. They really do have some pretty good technology in terms of keeping the engines in the cars, believe it or not. That's kind of where they hang their bailiwick, is on the safety issue, and they do it as good as anybody else, if not better. So we're going to be talking to Paul about that in the third hour. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, filling in for Alex. I'll be here the first 2 hours. The third hour, we're going to have Jakari Jackson and Paul Joseph Watson. Now, we're going to go through the news here in just a little bit, but, you know, I actually It's amazing what we do for our listeners. I actually threw myself on the sword last night and went to see World War Z. Yeah, I actually paid to see that. And we're going to have Alex talking about his anticipation of it because he had read the book. He knew what was the book was about. Actually, Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio got into a bidding war as to who is going to be able to film that. And Brad Pitt won, for better or worse, and they actually made something called a movie out of that, I guess you could call it. But Alex talked about the themes that were in the book. He talked about early releases of the script, and I can give you a review. I'll talk about the political aspects of it. I'll tell you right now that, you know, there's movies that you see that you really like, and then there's movies that you see and you say, you know, I could have waited to see that and seen it on Netflix or on cable. And then there's movies that, like, how did I waste 2 hours of my life? Well, World War Z is in that last category. I want my 2 hours of my life back. Not even the money that I wasted. I just want the time I wasted back. It was not even entertaining from the standpoint of an action film or a horror film or a suspense film or a science fiction film. It didn't deliver on any of those aspects. And it was just kind of if you've seen the previews, you've seen the special effects shots. You've seen the mass of humanity piling on top of each other like a bunch of ants. And that kind of sums up the whole attitude of the movie towards mankind. But we'll talk about the political underscoring of that. And that's why we do film reviews, is because it's important to understand how powerful film is, because it acts on not just an intellectual level, but it also acts on a subliminal level. You know, film is so effective because it manipulates our emotions at the same time that we're looking at what's on the screen. Movie soundtracks are so important, so much of a part of manipulating your emotions, but it's just a very visceral entertainment medium, and it really is able to deliver very deep messages to you, very subliminal messages. So it's important to take a step back and to look objectively at what is actually in these films, and we're going to be doing that a lot more here at InfoWars. And Alex has a film review comparing Superman to World War Z. We're going to play that at the bottom of the hour. And I'll follow up and tell you how they changed it from what was anticipated. But we've got in the news, of course, we're still looking at the Hastings death that happened in L.A. The FBI, these are some of the headlines on InfoWars. The FBI is saying that there's no investigation involving journalist Michael Hastings. Well, I guess which investigation are they talking about? Are they talking about the investigation where he tweeted just hours before he died that he was being investigated by the FBI? Or are they talking about they're not going to investigate the strange appearance of the car accident? It's probably the latter. Ted Cruz is launching a national petition against the Gang of Eight's bill. He said this is have to stop this immigration bill, he said. They're going to grant amnesty to 11 million illegal immigrants. You know, there's kind of a pattern of behavior that you see with the government. They'll go in and do the illegal, as Henry Kissinger said, the illegal we do immediately, the unconstitutional takes a little bit longer. They'll go in over and over again, violate the law, and we're seeing that happening now with the NDAA. They've released a new version of the NDAA for 2014, and what they're doing is they're putting in provisions. We've always been upset about this indefinite detention provision, Section 1023. They're now proposing another section that is going to give them legal cover for the kind of data collection, data mining, data storage that we all know that they've been doing for a long time, secretly, illegally, unconstitutionally. And so now they're going to pass a law to do that. Same thing is happening with illegal immigration. We know that it's illegal, but they're trying to pretend that it's not illegal. They do it even though it's against the law. They don't enforce the laws, they break the laws, and then eventually what they do to cover themselves, they amend the laws. And that's what we see is really happening with the Illegal Immigration Act right now. McClatchy, Washington Bureau, reports that government could use metadata to map your every move. Could use? They've been doing that for a very long time. We've got another one here. Lawyers are eyeing the NSA data as a treasure trove for evidence in murder and divorce cases. And I guess you could make the case that if the government has information that's in a criminal case, if they have it in their possession, they should surrender that. And but they're assuming that once they have taken our private information, once they've stolen our private information unconstitutionally, illegally, then that information is now secure and belongs to them. We've got 25,000 dead bumblebees discovered in Oregon. This is the largest documented bumblebee deaths in the western U.S., according to a conservation biologist, Rich Hatfield. They said they've never seen any kind of die-off of bumblebees on this scale before, and they're aware of a pesticide application in the vicinity, but have not yet identified the active ingredients. Well, there's some people that have done some research on that, and we've seen in other cases, people making cases that it is Roundup and some other chemicals and pesticides. We'll see what conclusions they come to. Seems like Monsanto, though, is kind of a special protected species. It's almost like an endangered species protection list that they've got. Nothing that Monsanto can do is basically ever called into question. And then we've got this story here about water. We've got a video that kind of lays this out. We're going to throw to that in just a second. And it's a story about some people going before a water board and complaining about their cloudy water and foul-tasting water. And the person who's there basically tells them, don't make unsubstantiated claims because we'll treat that as terrorism. Let's take a look at that video.
He might be able to, I think he was trying to answer your question.
Look, you guys have come up here and expressed concerns about water quality on several occasions. You brought us a stack of complaints. We called every one of them and said, do you have water problems? Do you want us to come test your water? Guess how many we got to say?
I've got your report right here, so I know exactly.
Yeah.
How many?
Let me ask, is one phone call a sufficient investigation of such serious complaint?
Well, we called them and said, do you want us to come down and test your water? No.
Were you called? Were anybody here called? And what was
Let me throw one thing out there just so you're aware, okay? We take water quality very seriously, very, very seriously. But you need to make sure that when you make water quality complaints, you have basis, because federally, if there's no water quality issues, that can be considered under Homeland Security an act of terrorism. So,
what, can you say that again, please?
yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
What I'm saying is, if you've got concerns about your drinking water, that's very important. We take that very seriously. But under federal regulation, if you make allegations against public water supply that are unfounded, then that can be considered under Homeland Security an act of terrorism, because you're trying to allege things.
And who would the you be in this case, Mr. Smith?
I'm just saying, I'm not making any accusations. I'm just telling you.
That's good. That's good. I hope you could hear that. The audio quality is not quite what we'd like to have, but you could hear that. He says, you got to be very careful, because under federal regulations, I could call you a terrorist if, we do this. Just don't question your masters. You say something about the water quality. We've gone from being ridiculed and being laughed at. Back in North Carolina, we had some people at Planet InfoWars that got together in social networking. That's our InfoWars social networking site. They got together to decide they would do some activism back in North Carolina. And the first thing they decided they would do would be go down to city council and talk to them about fluoridation of the water. And they were not only laughed at and cut off, they wouldn't allow them to run a piece that had been run by a local news crew talking about fluoridation and seriously taking a look at why it's been outlawed in European countries and other places. And they would not look at the health effects of that. They would not consider the idea as to whether or not, even if it was effective, do you really want to try to medicate people through the water supply? Is that the way that you deliver meds, is through the water supply? So they not only laughed at them, but they toasted them and mocked them with a glass of tap water. And now we've got officials in Tennessee saying, if you come in and talk about the quality of your water, I might just call you a terrorist. And he keeps throwing around the names of Homeland Security and federal laws as if that's supposed to scare people. Well, we got something at the federal government. It's called the Constitution. And you don't amend the Constitution by passing an appropriations act for the military like the NDAA. You know, they didn't amend the Constitution with Section 1023 by passing a law. If the law is unconstitutional, it's still unlawful. And all the assertions of that doesn't change. No matter how draconian they get, it doesn't change. It just shows that they are oath breakers and criminals if they violate the Constitution, especially when they pass a law. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight filling in for Alex. And we're going to have a very interesting guest coming up in the top of the next hour. We're going to have Dr. William Pepper. And this is a lawyer, a human rights lawyer who defended Martin Luther King and is trying to get a retrial for Sirhan Sirhan. There's some interesting new evidence about the trial of Sirhan Sirhan that came about 9 years ago with new technology. And so we're going to talk to Dr. Pepper about that. We're going to talk to him about the trial that was held for James Earl Ray. They never had a trial before for James Earl Ray because he just pleaded guilty. So they had a trial at the request of the King family. Dr. Pepper is a close friend of the King family and was a very good friend of Martin Luther King Jr. before he was killed. And they really wanted to get to the bottom of this because there was a lot of questions about the circumstances surrounding his death. Just as we see, there's a lot of circumstances that are suspicious about the death of Michael Hastings in L.A. This is something we covered a couple of nights ago on the Nightly News. It's something we talked a great deal about yesterday. It's something we're going to continue to talk about because the government is just coming out and doing things like tapping people's phones and breaking every kind of constitutional protection that we've got is just being ignored openly now by the government. We were looking at the evidence of it the other day, and Rob Jacobson had a great comment, and he said they just really don't care anymore. I mean, it used to be that the government did these types of things in secret that they're doing in open today, and they used to try to hide when they violated the law, when they killed people. But now we've got books being written by Pulitzer Prize-winning author, The Way of the Knife. Mark Mazzetti just came out talking about how Obama and George Bush are using the Secret Service as well as, not the Secret Service, but the CIA as well as the military in ways that they've never used them before openly. And just open assassination against people. And we also have the NSA scandals as far as the breaking tips of the iceberg now that we're starting to see. It's something that we've known has been going on for quite some time, but now they're revealing little bits of it. We've got a video coming up here in just a few minutes. If you remember a couple of days ago, there was some amazing video from the USA pageant, and Miss USA pageant, and they were asking them questions about these revelations about spying and data interception, and they were just fine with that. They had no problem at all with it. So we're wondering what would happen if they actually gave the right answer to that. And here's a short video about that.
Judge number 3, Nene Leaks, your question, please.
A recent report shows that in 40% of American families with children, women are the primary earners, yet they continue to earn less than men. What does this say about society?
Well, Nene, it sounds like you're referring to an oft-quoted but erroneous interpretation of a Census Bureau report that claims female workers earn 77 cents for every dollar made by a man. A wage disparity that mostly, but not completely, disappears when you contrast the relative earning power of both genders in equivalent occupations, which is why PolitiFact gave President Obama a rating of mostly false when he repeated this error on national television. Look, here he is.
So to anyone who says 77 cents on the dollar sounds pretty close to equal, I say, your math is bad.
Thank you. World peace out.
Thank you, Utah. Thank you, sweetheart.
Okay, there we go. Well, you know, it's not just the government doing things that are illegal and doing it in our face, but it's also the way that they're interacting with people. And as I said earlier in the show, I went to see World War Z last night, and just the us versus them mentality of the government elite. And that's really what they're focusing on in this movie. They're trying to set up the idea that if you're part of the military, if you're part of the government, you're going to be taken care of. Everybody else is either helpless or they're kind of a rabid problem, a rabid disease, a virus. That's something that we've seen, a meme that we've seen for a long time from people with the Gaia group. They basically posited this idea that Gaia is the spirit of the earth and a living organism. And as a living organism, humans are basically a destructive virus that at best needs to be contained, but it would be optimal if we could just wipe it out. And I have to say, that was really the feeling I got watching that movie last night, World War Z. But what comes from that kind of a mentality, a kind of us versus them, a kind of attitude that if you do something and you're part of the insider group, you're part of the official people with uniforms, you don't ever get called into question for anything you do. And we're going to be talking to somebody right after the break whose daughter, 11-year-old daughter, was tasered by police. How about that? The police couldn't handle an 11-year-old girl. They had to taser her. We're going to be talking to him right after the break, so stay tuned. You won't want to miss this. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, filling in for Alex. And we have a very, very disturbing story coming up here about a young girl who was tasered by the police. Now, I don't know if you've seen the recent previews for the movie that's coming out in August, Elysium. But at the beginning of that trailer tape, there's a very disturbing scene which is becoming more and more like the operating principle for our police in this country. In that scene, the star of the film, Matt Damon, is asked by a robotic cop something about what he's got in his bag or some kind of a question. And he kind of gives a little bit of a comedic, sarcastic answer. And the robot police just beat him to a pulp, basically. And that's what we're starting to see right now in the United States, because what's happening is no matter what the police do, they're simply given some kind of an administrative leave, maybe an unpaid, or maybe it's a paid leave where they're taken off of their duty. They get a vacation. They actually get rewarded in many cases, if you want to look at it. If they get a few days off and get an unpaid leave, or even if in some cases a paid leave while this is being investigated, and then they're reinstated. Even in situations where the police chief wants to get rid of the officer because of the brutality, he is opposed by the unions, and the officer is kept on. We've got a case coming out of Oregon that was written up by Don Salazar yesterday. Oregon State Police taser autistic child found wandering naked. He says in this article, when police found a confused and naked 11-year-old girl wandering a stretch of highway along the I-5 corridor in Oregon, they didn't exactly offer her a ride home. Instead, the responding officer determined the best course of action would be to taser her. Now, what was happening was a cab driver, Adam Bednar, came across this young girl walking down the highway, confused. She was nude and threw him a smile, indicating she wasn't fully aware of where she was or what she was doing. He said he thought she was drugged in some way, thought she might be on bath salts or meth or something like that. So he drove alongside her while he called the police. The trooper that arrived called for her to stop, and when she didn't obey the cop, he threatened to tase her, and he did. Now, we have a report from a local news station here that let's go ahead and throw to that report and see what they actually talked to some witnesses there at that report.
The young woman seen walking confused and naked right here near milepost 18 on I-5 is a juvenile. And because of that, state police aren't releasing her name or the exact details around her condition. But one eyewitness says the situation was like nothing he had ever seen.
That was about it.
It was a sight Adam Bednar says he wishes he could forget.
I don't know how to describe it, really. It was just shocking, that was all. You know, I couldn't believe that it was happening.
OSP officials describe a young girl, unresponsive and confused, wandering naked along the highway. It was Adam that first found her there.
I stopped the car in the middle of the freeway. I backed up. And she kind of looked in my window. She kind of laughed and kept on walking.
Adam drove alongside her while he called police. He says the trooper who arrived called for her to stop and threatened twice to tase her. After giving no response, 2 little red dots appeared on her back, then metal barbs.
She seized up and she just fell face first on the ground. Just face first on the ground.
OSP officials say it was necessary to prevent her from wandering further into the road and putting herself in danger. Adam, who helps troopers apprehend the girl on the hood of his car, says he isn't so sure.
She wasn't going off the road. She was set on walking down the freeway. And I think that had she waited for backup, they probably could have got her without the taser.
As for the reasons for her behavior, state police say she likely has autism. Adams says whatever it was baffling.
I thought she was drugged. I thought she was on, maybe bath salts, too much meth, something.
What is certain is that the young girl was not the victim of a crime, and she is reportedly safe with her family. But Adams says he isn't about to forget this case anytime soon.
Wow, the craziest experience of my life.
State police say the young woman in this case won't be charged with any crimes because she wasn't aware of her surroundings. They say the use of force is done at an officer's discretion, but they will be reviewing it to make sure it meets their policies. In Ashland, Justin Bork, Newswatch 12.
That's just amazing. I have an 11-year-old daughter, and don't tell me that a cop couldn't control an 11-year-old girl without tasering her. That is the most cowardly, disgusting thing I've ever heard, that someone would do that to an 11-year-old girl. Don't they have any capability of handling these situations? I mean, the whole idea of having a taser is that they're not exposing themselves to undue risk. Do they really feel like that 11-year-old girl presents a threat to the officer that he needs to use that? The fact that it's non-lethal force doesn't really mean anything. You've had people die from being tasered. You have people seriously injured from being tasered. As he said, she fell face forward when he tasered her. I just don't understand how the government allows police officers to get away with this time and time again. And when they do, it just makes them worse the next time. We've got on the phone here the father of the young girl who was tasered. And we want to ask him a few questions and get his comments on that. As a father, I'm absolutely outraged about that. Hello, are you there?
Yeah, I'm right here.
I don't want to use your name without any permission. Well, they've got it in there. You wanted to put your name up there, but that's fine. Tell us a little bit about this from your perspective.
Well, basically, we got a call at 6, a little before 6 in the morning from the Oregon State Police that they had my daughter. We have our house very well secured, but she's clever. Even though she doesn't talk, she's very clever, very perceptive, and she managed to unscrew the security mechanism we had on the window. And they call them runners. There's a lot of autistic children that have this characteristic. They like to, once they get out, they just run in whatever direction they want to go. She loves cars, and where are the most cars? On the freeway. She doesn't understand the danger. She doesn't understand any of that. But she got out, and we got a call at 6 in the morning, said they had my daughter. And I was grateful that they brought her back safe. Of course, as a parent, you got to be grateful for that, they bring your daughter back safe. But later developments, I hear that they had to taser her in order to bring her in. And it would seem that a naked, handicapped female wandering down the freeway, tasers would not be necessary in order to apprehend a child. I mean, tasers are dangerous. They can cause fatalities.
Oh, absolutely. Do you find your daughter physically threatening or intimidating when you are around her? Or other people find her very large and scary that you feel like the police would be justified in terms of tasering her?
Not at all. No. I mean, she is physically fit, but she certainly is not threatening. She's very gentle. She giggles. I'm sure when she was wandering down the freeway, she thought this was the greatest thing in the world. She was probably happy just cruising down the freeway. I mean, I know how she is when she gets out. She just thinks it's the greatest thing. She's happy. And the police have this way of always escalating the situation. They don't try to bring the situation down and apprehend a suspect in a diplomatic manner. They do it by escalating the situation.
Well, they pull up and they start making demands. Right. First thing they do is say, do this, do that. If you don't do that, then I'm going to tase you if you don't do what I say. And then they go ahead and tase people. They don't try to assess the situation. They don't try, as you said, to de-escalate the situation or really even try to ascertain what's going on. We had a situation here in Austin where there was a car accident, and the fellow that was involved in the car accident, I believe it was diabetes, but it was some kind of a physical condition where he was essentially unable to talk. And the cop came up and started telling him to get out of the car and do this or that, and the guy just sat there, wouldn't talk to the cop, and he started to threaten him with a taser, and then eventually tasered this guy who was physically unable to respond to him. So the question is, at this point, I guess, have you heard anything from the police department other than it's up to the officer's discretion as to how and when he uses force?
Well, it's just the basic generic statements that they had to taser her to save her life from running into traffic. But I have a tape recording from the witness, the taxi driver, that said that was absolutely not the case, that the police were lying, in fact, that she was not in any danger. They had her cornered. The traffic was completely stopped. There was no need to taser whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I can play that audio. I did interview the guy this morning.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that. Let's play that. That's audio that you interviewed the taxi driver who was the eyewitness to this?
Yeah, Adam.
Okay.
You ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
The officers are lying. They're lying out their teeth. The girl is not in danger of being run over. I had all the traffic stopped. The officer had the traffic stopped. We need to pursue this. Okay. We need to be held accountable.
And we talked for a good 45 minutes, and he detailed the whole situation. They had traffic stopped. There was no danger that she was in. There was no danger. The freeway traffic was completely stopped. And obviously my daughter she's not an aggressive type. She doesn't attack people. She was just intent on cruising down the road and doing her thing. That's kind of how these autistic kids do their thing. They put their sight on a direction and they go.
Right. Well, I guess the question, though, is that they are using these tasers almost like whips. Do what I say or I'm going to electronically whip you. Right. What do you think is the answer to this as a parent? What would you like to see happen?
Well, in this circumstance, what I would like to have seen happen is the officer or whoever to walk up, grab her by the hand and say, come on, sweetie, get in the car. She's very cooperative in that respect. She loves cars. She hops in strangers' cars just out of nowhere if someone is nice to her. I mean, she's obsessed with cars and going places. So she sees the freeway as a place to go places. I mean, she doesn't understand these things at all.
Absolutely.
It'd be perfectly easy to determine that the situation is a handicap shop. To walk up, grab her by the hand, say, come on, sweetie, let's get in the car. And you'd think it was actually a female officer. It was not a male officer. It was a female officer.
Well, I would think even a female officer wouldn't be physically afraid of a 11-year-old girl that's not acting aggressively. Like you said, she's just walking along the side of the highway.
Well, what's there to be afraid of if you're an armed, trained officer?
Exactly.
No traffic coming, and here's a naked little girl. What's there to be afraid of? I mean, they have to apprehend defensive and offensive male and female subjects all the time that might be armed and might do this. It seems obvious that with a naked child, it would be pretty easy to apprehend and get the child to a safe area without.
You can't make the case that maybe she's got some kind of a concealed weapon. You know, even though we're talking about an 11-year-old child, I mean, the typical excuses that these people have are, well, I thought they had a weapon or they pulled a weapon. You can see that the child's got nothing at all. Like you said, totally naked, empty-handed, walking alongside the road, an 11-year-old girl, and it's necessary to just taser her because she's not following the orders of her lords and masters in uniform.
Right, and she wasn't pursuing the officer. She was still doing her thing, wandering down the freeway. They had traffic completely stopped by the witness account, and they shot her in the back. Not in the front. She wasn't approaching them. She wasn't weaving into traffic or anything. They had traffic completely stopped. So they use the taser now as a first means of apprehending suspects. It's supposed to be basically a barrier between having to shoot or use lethal force.
That's right.
But now it's just a way of apprehending anybody.
It's become so common. We get these stories all the time because it's a story that we're concerned about here at InfoWars. We're concerned about civil liberties. We're concerned about an out-of-control government. So people send us these stories all the time. We see so much of this, and there's no concern about the use of tasers. It's just random procedure. And as you said, it's become the first thing they do. They don't even stop and think about it. I think what's needed at the local level is we've got to have some politicians who are going to say, every time they do this, it's going to be treated as if it was a shooting. There's going to be an investigation. And I think there needs to be an investigation when the police use force, even non-lethal force. There needs to be an investigation as to whether or not that force is warranted or not. And I think that investigation needs to be done by a group of citizens, not internally, not having the foxes guarding the chicken house, so to speak. They're not going to police themselves, basically. We have to know who's going to police the police, who's going to watch the watchers. That's always the question in a society that wants to remain free. And if we don't have the answer to that question, we're not going to remain free.
Well, also, you have to kind of recognize that in order to apprehend a suspect, you have to assault them. You have to commit a crime in order to apprehend somebody. I mean, that's an assault, blatant assault on a child in order to apprehend them. If anybody did that in a different situation, they would be charged with assault. So the government has this means of creating legislation in order to monopolize that they're the only ones that can get away with assaulting people. The police can get away with tasing, shooting, and beating people up in order to apprehend them. And a lot of them aren't even guilty of a crime, they're just suspected of one. So government has this nature of creating legislation, so they're the only ones that can get away with committing the acts of assault or whatever. And then it's perfectly acceptable for the government to do it.
And it's very instructive, too, when we look at the gun control debate. What they're talking about is essentially giving the government a monopoly on the use of force. And as you're just talking about, when they have that kind of monopoly, like in a situation where they walk up and there's an unarmed 11-year-old girl, how do they respond? And this is not an isolated case. This is a pattern of behavior that we see over and over again. If you want to know what's going to happen when only the police have guns, when only the criminals have guns, then take a look at Mexico, take a look at Chicago. These are not the kind of people that we can trust with a monopoly on force. There has to be some oversight, and there has to be essentially a deterrent, knowing that other people have arms, I think. But it's something that's very disturbing to see that they can do whatever they please. There's never any accountability. There's never any guidelines for the use of tasers. I don't know of any guidelines for the use of tasers. It always seems to be at the discretion of the police force in every location I've looked at.
Well, journalism, I mean, is supposed to be kind of the countermeasure towards government getting away with whatever they want. But what happens is journalism and the network media get in kind of, forget the term, but in an incestuous relationship to where the media needs the government and the government needs the media. The media isn't serving us necessarily.
Oh, yeah.
They're serving themselves.
Oh, absolutely. The media has been consolidated down to about 5 big companies. And they basically, whether you're talking about local issues or whether you're talking about big national issues of civil liberties, they take the government side. They're the government's mouthpiece. They make the excuses for the government.
Right. And so it becomes a single kind of organism, if you will, that really doesn't have our interests in mind as far as citizenry. They have their own interests in mind. And the media needs the government and the government needs the media. It becomes one kind of thing. And it certainly doesn't have the citizenry's interest in mind. And what confines the government? The Constitution. So wouldn't the government have the most interest in dismantling what confines it? I mean, and they've been systematically doing it over the years, case by case and incident by incident. They'll use whatever they can to dismantle various rights systematically over the years. So basically,
that's exactly what whistleblower Drake said. NSA whistleblower Drake said. He said after 9/11, the government took off the chains of the Constitution. We had Patrick Henry say, bind them down with the chains of the Constitution. Well, they've cut those chains now, and they're pretty much doing anything that they want to. Well, thank you so much for coming forward and speaking out about this. I'm very sorry that happened to your daughter. Hopefully, some good will come of it as people realize that we need to get some control over the conduct of the police. We'll be right back.
Hello,
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight filling in for Alex. We were just talking in the last break to a father whose 11-year-old daughter was tasered by the police. Rather than talk to her, rather than try to ascertain why she was walking alongside the road without any clothes, calmly walking alongside the road, according to the eyewitness cab driver who called the police, they just tasered her. She didn't obey their orders. They just tasered her. They could see that she didn't have any weapons because she wasn't wearing any clothes. She's autistic. Why she was out at that time. They didn't try to ascertain that. And the question is, what are we going to do to try to control government at the local level? And it's getting worse. The 2014 National Defense Authorization Act is now being constructed, and it's getting worse every year with this. If you remember last year, I think the first one that came out was in 2012. And remember, Barack Obama was not going to sign that, and he said he didn't need it. And then at the last minute on a New Year's Eve, he signed it and then said, don't worry, I'm not going to enforce it. Then when it came up for reauthorization, they said that they were going to put some protections in it. And we had Dianne Feinstein come in and put a fig leaf amendment in it that Stuart Rhodes of Oath Keepers and others argued really wasn't going to do anything, but it gave cover to senators who might have to oppose it because of their commitments to civil liberties. It actually got unanimous support in the Senate and never got to be tested, because when it went to the Joint Committee to be reconciled between the Senate and the House, McCain and the House members just arbitrarily threw that out. And so it stood just as it was the year before. Well, now it's coming around again for 2014, and it's actually going to get worse. What they're doing is, and we talked about this at the beginning, they, just like with the immigration bill, they do things that violate the law or they don't enforce the law. And then what they come in and do later is they pass a law that justifies what they've been doing all along. And that's what we're seeing happening with the NDAA Act. We know that for a long time, the government has been tapping people's phone lines. We know that they've been storing data. They've been mining the data. This is starting to come out now, just the tip of it with Ed Snowden's releases. They're still talking about how, don't worry, it's only the metadata. Well, that's not what we're hearing from NSA whistleblowers. They're telling us it's everything, and they're telling us that it's been stored. As a matter of fact, there's a interview with one of the original NSA whistleblowers on the boilingfrogs.com website. Now, that's Sibel Edmonds' site. She has been one of the premier whistleblowers. Daniel Ellsberg called her one of the most important whistleblowers ever, said she was more important than the revelations that he had about the Pentagon Papers. Sibel Edmonds was an FBI translator, and she had information that the FBI was actually working with Al-Qaeda leading up to 9/11. And they came after her pretty hard, but she's got a site here, and she talks to another NSA whistleblower, Russ Tice. And this is something you need to go by and take a look at on their website. In this video, Mr. Tice explains in detail how the NSA targets, sucks in, stores, analyzes, and illegally obtained content from the masses in the United States. And he maintains that the new data center that's being built in Utah, the NSA's Utah facility, is already operating and online. We've been told that it's not going to come online and start operating until sometime in September. He says it's already online. He reveals that the NSA is a deep state that targets and wiretaps U.S. political candidates for their own purpose. And that's a very interesting revelation, because if they can come after political candidates, and he mentions a Supreme Court judge that is now sitting, he doesn't mention by name, if they can blackmail and investigate judges and CIA directors, they can come after you as well. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. Alex is not here. I'm David Knight, filling in for him, and we're going to be joined in just a few minutes by Dr. William Pepper, very well-known human rights international lawyer. And while we're on this topic of what's legal and what's not, as we were talking about just before the hour, the new NDAA 2014 is coming up. And in an article from truthout.org, they point out that two sections, Section 206 of the Patriot Act, that permitted government to obtain secret court orders allowing roving wiretaps without requiring identification of the person, organization, or facility to be surveyed, and Section 215 of the Patriot Act authorizing government to access and obtain any tangible thing that is relevant to a terrorist investigation. Those were things that joined the FISA Act that was passed all the way back in 1978. Now, FISA has come into the news quite a bit with the revelations from Ed Snowden, and it was the core thing behind the resignation of several whistleblowers right after September 11th. Whistleblowers William Binney, Drake, and Wiebe all testified that they tried to get the NSA to not do what it did after September 11th, and that is use a dragnet to get domestic information. Prior to that, since 1978, the NSA had been looking at foreign information. And these guys were technical personnel who had developed a system they called Thin Thread. And with Thin Thread, they would eliminate domestic information. But the U.S. government, in the aftermath of 9/11, went with a different program called Trailblazer. And they criticized it not only for its blatant violation of the Constitution, blatant violation and extension of the powers that they'd been given with FISA, the unlawful extension of those powers. But they also pointed out that it wasn't even effective. Just like the TSA is not effective as a security organization at the airport, this was not effective in terms of trying to find people who really were the needles in the haystack of this data, the people who really were bad actors. It was absolutely ineffective in that. But it was a very expensive program. It transferred a lot of money to the companies that were well connected within the military-industrial complex, and it's their accusation that that's the reason they went with it. These people tried to reform this internally. They followed all the internal procedures, going to the Inspector General, going to the Department of Justice, but they came after them personally, indicted all of them, eventually let the three of the four people go. They came after Drake and tried to pin him down because of a bogus charge that he had mishandled documents. They didn't accuse him of transmitting any state secrets, and it turned out that the documents they had listed, many of them were not classified. Some of them had been retroactively classified after they found them in his residence. And they are now very outspoken critics. And as I mentioned just before the break, there is a Russ Tice, who is also a critic of the NSA, a former NSA whistleblower. And in an interview on bowlingfrogs.com, that's C. Bell Edmonds, a FBI whistleblower about 9/11. This is the money quote from that interview. He said, here's the big one. This was the summer of 2004. One of the papers that I held in my hand was to wiretap a bunch of numbers associated with a 40-something-year-old wannabe senator for Illinois, he said. You wouldn't happen to know where that guy lives right now, would you? Well, it's a big White House in Washington, D.C. They basically went after Barack Obama. So this is something that's been going on for a long time. And we don't excuse this by saying that it started with Bush, because Obama, as the subject of these kind of illegal investigations, has now turned around and made it even worse and made it even more public. And that's the real danger. Stay tuned. Right after the break, we're going to be talking to Dr. William Pepper, and we're going to ask him what he thinks about the surveillance state and what he thinks about what this country is turning into as far as ignoring human rights and the Constitution. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, filling in for Alex today. We have a very important and interesting guest that's going to be coming on in just a minute or so. It's Dr. William Pepper. Dr. Pepper is a human rights law advocate. He is a barrister from the United Kingdom, admitted to the bar in numerous jurisdictions throughout the United States. Now, he was involved in the televised trial of James Earl Ray. It was a mock trial to attempt to get Ray the trial that he never had. And he's also been involved in a recent trial trying to get a retrial for Sirhan Sirhan, filing motions to get a retrial based on new evidence that has surfaced as recently as within the last 10 years. There's been a lot of evidence that's surfaced about that, so we're going to talk to him about that, as well as cases that are breaking now. One thing I want to get his opinion on, and this is a breaking piece of news, the judges who preside over America's secret court. This is out of Reuters. It says 12 of the 14 judges who have served this year on the most secret court in America are Republicans. Half are former prosecutors. What we're seeing here with the FISA court, we're told not to worry about all these releases of NSA snooping because it's all been authorized by these judges. Well, it turns out that they fly them in for a short period of time. They're actually working on, as regular judges in their jurisdiction, they fly them in from time to time. They do a cursory review of this stuff and just say, go ahead and do it. There's not any sense of a reasonable cause when you give the government permission to look at the phone information for millions of American customers. Don't tell me that they did any kind of an investigation about that. So what we're going back to is we're kind of overthrowing the rule of law and the overthrow of things like star chambers. We're going back to things that we'd hoped we'd left behind in the dark ages. And so I'd like to get Dr. Pepper's comment about that. Dr. Pepper, thank you for joining us today.
It's good to be with you.
What do you think about that? What do you think of the secret courts that we're told that we don't have anything to worry about because all these FISA releases are being overseen by a judge and so in a secret court? So they've okayed that, and we're not allowed to see those decisions, what the basis of that was, but we should be reassured that we have judges, even though they're secret, looking over this stuff. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the basis of any democracy is accountability. and ultimately accountability to the people. And one of the problems with secrecy of any kind, including the deliberations that go before the FISA courts, is that the people are not given the opportunity to understand the underlying basis and reason for, as you did say, the decisions that are being made. When you have a situation where, as we did have in America, and in my view, this is not the country I grew up in, you had a separation of powers that meant something, where there was a crossover in terms of checks and balances, and we're moving further and further away from that. And I think you're quite right, into a more secretive society. And the FISA courts are, which have been around for some time now, are only one example of the movement towards secrecy and the unaccountability of the government, particularly the executive. And if you had a Congress that was willing to look at the actions of the executive, and here you have to understand the executive acts also by executive order. And those executive orders, so many people in the United States don't even know anything about. And,
absolutely.
Yet the last two presidents have exhibited a great tendency to rule by executive order. So we don't have congressional accountability, despite a lot of the bluff and the bluster that goes on over nothing, really. And major issues are just ignored. So I think the people should be aware, and I think people should be concerned, and look to trying to reestablish the rule of law in an accountable way.
What do you think about the parallels to the Nixon impeachment when we look at what Obama has done? To me, it's amazing the parallels, the nature of what he was accused of, basically using the IRS against enemies, wiretapping people. We see the same things happening with the Obama administration, but the magnitude and the extent of it are so much greater, and yet there's absolutely no talk about impeachment from either party.
Well, I mean, this guy is in league with the ruling forces of the society.
Right.
And they dominate the Congress, and they control the whole process of impeachment.
And that's exactly what you were saying in the beginning. You said that this is not the country that you grew up in, because when Nixon was around, at least there was some checks and balances going on from one branch to the other. The Congress would actually stand up and say something about some of these illegal actions, whereas today they just are complicit and go along with it.
Well, yeah, you don't have any devotion to the Constitution.
No.
Really, with few exceptions, and I'm going to say there are some exceptions, but with few exceptions, the Constitution seems to be capable of being ameliorated, pushed aside, all in the name of this new war, this war on terror. And now they're moving this the fear of terrorism very clearly into the domestic side of things. You know, foreign terrorists were the major concern after 9/11. Well, we've crossed that bridge, and we're now involved with concern about domestic terrorism. And I think the number of war games that the Pentagon has slated, and they're available on the Pentagon's website, are indicative of the fact that they are now gearing up for massive crackdown.
Absolutely.
And I think it's going to ultimately lead to a suppression of all dissent. I think that's where it's heading.
We've talked over and over again on this show about how they have set up war games, as you mentioned it, in various cities where they go in and they have joint exercises between the military and the police. And it's being done on an increasingly frequent basis. Part of it is getting people accustomed to that. But the other part of it is, as they said, they like to train in a scenario that they're going to be engaged in. So when you see them in American cities working with the police, you can understand that they're not training for the invasion of Syria, because they don't think that they're going to get the cooperation of the police in Syria. They're training for domestic oppression. That's what they're training in with these different exercises. Don't you believe that?
Well, yeah, they've been at this for a long time. The militarization of the police has been going on for well over 35 years. It's been gradual. Mm-hmm. They've been infiltrated by intelligence agencies and the Defense Department, and I think it's virtually complete at this point in time. And the Americans, it's happening right under their noses. Unfortunately, they don't know and maybe don't want to know. There's a whole psychological mindset that I think you have to be very conscious of and aware of. And it's very easy for citizens in a republic like this to go into a situation of denial where they just don't want to know. And that is what's most frightening to me, because the only two roads to power and change are money and numbers. Since we know who controls the money, the numbers are the only route available. And if you don't have a mobilized population, as the Occupy movement in its infancy attempted to establish, we're in deep trouble here.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I'd like to talk to you about is the Sirhan Sirhan case, because that is something that just came up recently, and you're trying to get a new trial for Sirhan Sirhan based on evidence there. It's a fascinating case that's there, but I guess part of it that fascinates me is the fact, and I really respect what you've done, because when you stand up against something that is the narrative of the mainstream media, like the case of the Sirhan Sirhan, you get called a conspiracy theorist, you get ridiculed, and yet it's not an open and shut case. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I and my colleague Laurie Dusick agreed to take on the Sirhan habeas corpus petition after his then current lawyer Larry Cheater died. We didn't do it. I didn't do it quickly, and I didn't do it surreptitiously or frivolously, because of exactly what you say. I have to be very careful. I try to be very careful about getting involved in causes and fights, because if your fight is not well grounded, if your position is not substantial, you do get attacked. And if you make a mistake along the way, and no matter how small or minor, that of course will be magnified. So you really do have to be, when you're coming up against the forces involved in these kinds of cases, and I'm talking about political assassinations, you really do have to be very careful. And I studied that file for a better part of a couple of years, and before I finally agreed to do it. Remember, when I agreed to represent James Earl Ray, I had taken 10 years of working on that case before I agreed to represent James, who was after me for a long time, to do it.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to be absolutely certain that he played, not only did he not do it, but he played no knowing role in the assassination of Martin King. So I started in 78. It was 88 before I took him on. With respect to Sirhan, we came on in around 2007, I guess, after we really went carefully through the file. Now, this wasn't a particularly important case for me personally, because as I knew Martin King the last year of his life and was very close to him during that period when I was much younger and I'd come back as a journalist from Vietnam, I also knew Bobby Kennedy. I was his Citizens Chairman when he ran for the Senate in New York State in 1964 in Westchester County. I ran his campaign, and I was, though I was very young, I had a fairly large following of reform type.
Hang on, Dr. Pepper. We're gonna continue. I want to hear the rest of this, and I know everybody's going to want to hear about the Sirhan Sirhan case, because it's not an open and shut case as we've been told. Hang on, we'll be back after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Dr. William Pepper. He had a trial for the Martin Luther King assassination, the trial that James Earl Ray never got. And just recently, he has moved for a retrial of Sirhan Sirhan based on some new evidence that turned up in 2004. And it's very interesting to see that it may take a very long time. As he mentioned just before the break, he spent 10 years investigating the Martin Luther King assassination before he decided to take the case. Even though he was in touch with the Martin Luther King family, they had questions about the story as presented by the government. And, of course, there had never been a trial because James Earl Ray pled guilty so that he would not get the death penalty. And it takes a long time for the truth to come out. We're just learning this week that a new documentary is coming out about the Flight 800, the TWA Flight 800, that happened about 17 years ago, blew up in midair, had a lot of witnesses say that they saw a missile They saw something that looked like flares going out and up to the plane and then exploding in the plane. We had transcriptions of pilots talking to the air traffic control saying the similar thing. We had the FBI going around and confiscating data from people. Now we've got 6 whistleblowers who are probably now retired and want to get the truth out. We saw the same thing with the Oklahoma City bombing with a noble lie. And now we have a documentary that is coming out from InfoWars. We're going to have that exclusively here at InfoWarsShop.com. And that is State of Mind. And it talks about mind control and how that's been around for quite some time. And that actually plays a part in the Sirhan Sirhan story. Tell us a little bit about that, Dr. Pepper.
Right. Well, I mean, we can go through the litany of evidence in the Sirhan case. We became convinced that he was totally and actually innocent of the assassination and was used as a patsy. We had initially suspected that there was some mind control activity at work because of his failure to remember very critical events in the pantry consistently, historically, over the years, which would in fact have enabled him to explain what was happening. So what we one of the things we did was to bring in Dr. Daniel Brown from Harvard, who is a specialist in hypnoprogramming. Hypnoprogramming doesn't mean hypnotism alone. It's the use of chemicals and drugs in combination with hypnosis.
And this is something that the CIA has admitted to doing since at least the 60s, going back to the 50s, actually, with Frank Olson. It was already well into it. He died sometime in the 1950s.
Yeah, they've been involved in this tactic for quite a long period of time,
right?
And have developed it with a degree of sophistication. Dan spent over 70 hours over a period of 3 years and 70 different sessions with Sirhan. And we have filed his massive reported opinion and affidavit, and it's pretty clear that Sirhan was, in fact, put through a 2-week mind control session at a specific clinic.
Now, Sirhan claims that he doesn't remember shooting. Actually, he thought he was at a shooting range. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, this is what they had programmed him to recall, that he had been at a shooting range that afternoon, and he was programmed on cue, which was a pinch on the neck for the handler. The handler was a woman who attached herself to him in the hotel and went into the pantry and sat with him and effectively controlled him. He was used fundamentally just to distract. He was used to on the pinch to get up and see a target, a shooting range target in front of him, and then begin to pull the trigger. He got off 2 shots, and then he was swamped, and his hand was pinned to the table. Mm-hmm. And we have 6 eyewitnesses who saw him being pinned to the table after the table after the second shot. So he kept pulling the trigger robotically, but his hand was on the table, and the bullets were careening all over the pantry. Meanwhile, the actual assassin put 3 bullets at powder burn range into the back of Senator Kennedy, 2 through his coat and 1 through his right ear, which into the brain, which killed him. And that was the fatal shot. A 4th shot went through his shoulder pad. So 4 shots were fired from the rear. Sirhan was never toward the rear. He was always in front of the senator. I mean, we have 12 eyewitnesses, who independently always placed him in front of the senator, never behind him. Amazing revelation. We're going to continue on with that. It's extraordinary.
We've got a break coming up. We're going to continue right with that. We'll be right back after the break. Dr. Pepper.
We're on the mark.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and I'm talking to Dr. William Pepper. And he's trying to get a retrial for Sirhan Sirhan, the accused killer of Robert Kennedy. And we were talking just before the break about how Sirhan Sirhan maintains, and Dr. Pepper's had testimony from expert psychologists, he maintains that he was under mind control, that he did not know where he was or what he was doing. He believed that he was shooting at a target range. And Dr. Pepper was just telling us before the break that he only got 2 shots off. And then people around him pinned his hand to the table. And he continued to fire until he fired all 8 shots. And he fired randomly into the crowd of spectators there. Meanwhile, Robert Kennedy was killed with 3 shots from behind at point-blank range, as Dr. Pepper puts it, powder burn range. And he was just telling us about some of the details about that. This is not just assertions. Think about how this was played in the media. Think about how they focused on the open and shut case. Here we have a person shooting Robert Kennedy as he's walking through the hotel lobby, and we've got it all on videotape, and here's what we saw, and they just tell you what they saw, and they don't talk about the fact that witnesses pinned his hand to the table after just 2 shots. They just maintain that that's the truth. It's a consistent story across the media because they only had 3 different networks. Now I guess you could say we've got basically one network that's telling the same story. People hear the same story every channel they turn to, so that's evidently the truth. But it's not, is it, Dr. Pepper?
No, it's certainly not the truth. The corporate media is not going to reveal the truthful facts about these kinds of cases because the government is involved. And they will continue and perpetuate the cover-up to the extent that they can for as long as they possibly can. You know, Carl Bernstein alerted us to the fact that there were over 400 intelligence agents spread throughout all of the media in America in very senior positions as well as stringers. And they make a point of influencing what goes in and what stays out. And the masses are not going to be told that what really has happened.
There was some new evidence that came out in 2004. Tell us about that audio tape.
Yeah, there was an audio tape. It was a tape recorder that was running by it's called a Brzezinski tape by a journalist researcher who was there, and it had been known from the beginning, and it was a part of the archival evidence, but it was not possible to do the kind of very precise analysis of the sounds on that tape. It really that technology only developed in the middle of the 2000s, 2005, 2006, and we were able to get a computerized analysis of the sounds on the tape, and it indicated that 13 bullets. They identified 13 bullets as having been fired. The 13 bullets were fired from 2 different directions, west to east and east to west. Sirhan was firing east to west. Bullets came the other way from west to east. There were 2 different types of guns. They were both .22 calibers, but there was a slightly different. It's amazing that they can detail it's a sort of like a radiological difference in the weapons that were fired. And there were some overlapping shots, which means when Sirhan fired his first the 2 shots, and then the balance from the table kept pulling the trigger, there were like shots 3, 4, for example, of the 13 were overlapping. So it was very clear there were 2 guns being fired in the pantry at that time, and that, of course, backs up the truth that Bob Kennedy was killed from the rear with bullets fired in a slightly upward angle with a gun virtually pressed against his body.
Now there was also some behind him. There was also some physical evidence about the bullets being fired at an upward angle too, wasn't there? Wasn't there some bullets that went into the ceiling or something like that?
Yeah, there were bullets. There were shots that went over up into the into the dropped ceiling level, and the one that went through Bob's shoulder pad was another upward shot. There were 4 upward shots fired, 3 of which from behind him, 3 of which did hit hit him. So this is the kind of evidence and the kind of analysis, in some cases, either was not available or was not presented to the jury at the time. So we believe that there is a legitimate claim under law for Sirhan to be given. Well, we think he should be turned loose, frankly, because of the there were two of the bullets that were introduced in evidence were not the real fatal bullets. We've established that as well. They were not bullets that were fired from Sirhan's gun. So the evidence is so strong that we think actual innocence is clear. And if you're not going to turn him loose, of course, but we would hope they would give him a new trial. If they won't give him a new trial, we would hope at least we can get an evidentiary hearing where, for the first time, all of this new evidence can be put out under oath. That's really what we would like to see happen. This is a man who's been in prison, as you can imagine, for all of these years, and for a crime that he didn't commit.
That's right. You might even consider doing a documentary. I mean, when we go back and look at the Oklahoma City bombings, the Noble Lie went back and talked to so many eyewitnesses and put together so much information. I was aware of a lot of what had been discovered at the time that it happened. I was following it. I knew about the bomb blast patterns not matching and being testified to that by a former general who was a demolitions expert, not matching the kind of blast pattern that you would have from a single bomb, single point source. There was a lot of information like that it was pretty clear that it didn't match the official story. There was, like I said, about Flight 800, we had a lot of eyewitnesses talking about seeing flares, identifying it as a missile, as a cruise missile, surface-to-air missile. But in each of these cases, we see that the FBI is going around and not just not doing an investigation, but actually taking evidence away. And so that's why I think part of the Sirhan story, as we point out, involves mind control. And that's something that people have kind of laughed off as conspiracy theories or science fiction, that sort of thing. But as you said, and as we know, and as this documentary, State of the Mind, is going to point out, it is very well documented. This has been going on for a very long time. It was in the 1950s that Frank Olson died as we believe, at the hands of the CIA, as his family maintains. And he was part of mind control experiments at that time in the mid-50s that have been going on for quite some time. So I think it's very important. Maybe you might consider doing a documentary to get the story out.
Well, I'm not a filmmaker. I'm a lawyer. I'm happy to cooperate with people who want to do documentaries on these kinds of cases.
Sure.
But I've got to keep my eye on the issues and do what a human rights lawyer should do. Try to right a wrong, rectify an injustice, and that's.
Oh, absolutely.
That's a pretty big task in itself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I understand. You're not a filmmaker, you're a lawyer, and you do what you do very well, and we really appreciate you standing up for the truth. Now, you've got a new trial that is coming up that you wanted to talk about that you've just started as well. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it's in the early stages yet, and it's a work of a man named Peter Janney, who has published a book called Mary's Mosaic. Peter has worked for about 35 years on that case. The Mary in it is Mary Meyer. Now, the fascinating thing about this case, it's a 50-year-old case. She was assassinated in 1964 in Washington, D.C. She was the only woman Jack Kennedy ever loved and was very, very close to him, and it's quite clear he was going to marry her. I mean, people close to them knew that and said that after the second term. Mary had been married, she's a very prominent Washington person, had been married to Cord Meyer, who was a deputy director of the CIA. And she just had so much of their operations that she couldn't take it, and she divorced him. And then she became close to Jack Kennedy, and they really had a mission for peace. She was about turning him into a real fighter, a warrior, if you will, for peace. And Jack Kennedy, as you know, delivered a famous speech at American University and began to turn directly in that issue it was beyond that. I mean, she got Tim Leary up at Harvard to give her acid, and she took the president, believe it or not, on his only acid trip to try to open him up. And I think she was very successful and very much in love. And as Peter Janney has documented so well in his book and his work, she came to a point when they assassinated Jack Kennedy. She knew how it happened. And she waited for the Warren Commission report to come out. That report was a total cover-up, as many people believe.
Oh, yeah.
She confronted her ex-husband, Gord Meyer, and said that quite clearly she was going to blow the whistle on him and Jim Angleton and the agency because of their involvement in the assassination if they didn't allow the truth to come forward about how Jack was killed. Well, this is a brave and courageous and marvelous woman. And frankly, they then assassinated her. They killed her on a towpath when she went for a daily walk outside of her home in Georgetown. They had her assassinated. They set up a black guy, Ray Crump. They tried him, and a wonderful, talented lawyer named W. Roundtree got him acquitted because they didn't have the evidence. They didn't have any forensics, any fibers, they had no evidence. And a witness saw someone, allegedly, this was a part of the staging, standing over the body, was 5 foot 8 inches tall, 185 pounds. Crump was about 5'3", 135 pounds. I mean, it was ludicrous. So the jury, and that's why we love the jury system, isn't it? They acquitted this guy. So it's been an unsolved murder to this point in time. And Peter Janney has identified a key person who was involved in that conspiracy. And yes, he apparently was an intelligence agent. He was there. He was on the scene. And he was used. And we are looking at a way, and it's not easy, as you can imagine, after 50 years, but we're looking at a way to try to bring this into a courtroom where all of the evidence that Peter has uncovered can be put before a judge and jury. And I took this on. I watched Peter's work for a number of years and advised him and stayed in the background, finally agreed to do it, to come on as his counsel, because I came to see that this is maybe the most important of the assassinations because it links. It links to the assassination of Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, because she was, of course, involved in discussions with the two of them in terms of all kinds of matters. She visited the White House 40 times in the October before the president was killed in November.
Wow.
So she's very powerful, behind-the-scenes influence to combat the Cold War and to bring America away from the Cold War into a peaceful perspective. And, of course, that's one of the things that was held against John Kennedy, that he was looking to normalize relations with Cuba, that he had entered into serious discussions with Khrushchev.
Well, you talk about Kennedy's peace movements. He actually stopped Operation Northwoods, which was really kind of a template for 9/11. If people want to know why we believe, one of the reasons why we believe it is because they had planned it decades before, doing exactly the same thing.
He walked out of one time after another. The Joint Chiefs came at him. Curtis LeMay and Lemnitzer came at him. They wanted a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union, a nuclear strike. I mean, one thing after another. These military guys were on Kennedy, and when he questioned them specifically and precisely about detail, they didn't have them. They didn't know that there were 100 land-based surface missiles throughout Cuba. They didn't even know that. And if there had been the invasion that they were looking to mount, it would have been a disaster for mainland United States as well as for any invading force.
Absolutely. Yeah, for people who don't know, I mean, look at Operations Northwoods. That was a plan to fly planes into buildings and blame it on Cuba so they could have an excuse to attack Cuba. It was a plan to do bombs in civilian areas, a campaign of terrorism so they could blame it on Cuba and then invade Cuba.
Exactly right.
And when Limitzer was let go by Kennedy, he goes to NATO, and you see in NATO, you see Operation Gladio, where they had a campaign of terror there that they then turned around and blamed on the communists so they could move their agenda forward there.
Well, there's no question about that. You know, and if Bob Kennedy had been elected president, although on the record and officially he never made this commitment, but he did to some of who were very close to him. And he did say one of his first tasks was going to be to reopen the investigation of the assassination of his brother, and in that that's a collaboration right across with the encouragement, of course, of Mary Meyer. So I think this is a political assassination. People don't know about it. It's an unsolved murder, and I applaud Peter Janney for all of his work, and I'm happy to do what I can do to bring those facts to light because they relate to the other critical assassinations on either side of her death. And
yes.
I'm happy to do that.
Well, you know, it's always a worthwhile thing to go in and search for the truth. And I really appreciate the fact that, as you said, you made sure that you had careful evidence. You went in and you looked for 10 years at the Martin Luther King assassination before you went into it. So we don't want to go in half-cocked about stuff, and we don't want to start throwing around wild accusations, but when you see something that's not right, when you see something that doesn't match the official story, it takes a lot of courage to go against that and to stand up and point out the emperor has no clothes, to say that this isn't true, that, you know, here's what really happened, even especially when it's something like in the case of Sirhan Sirhan, where he talks about having been under mind control. The public is really not ready to accept that on a broad basis yet. We have a lot of education to do because, as we both said, this has been going on for over 60 years, and they've turned it into something of a science. This is something that the CIA, as well as other black ops, have been doing for quite a long time. We're going to be right back with Dr. William Pepper right after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, filling in for Alex here in Austin. A little bit of housekeeping before we go back to our guest, Dr. William Pepper. Infidel Body Armor at infidelbodyarmor.com. Take a look at their product. It stops hundreds of rounds of AK-47, M4, 3060, 308, and more. It's ceramic armor, just stops 6 rounds, but this goes beyond that. This stops hundreds of rounds. It's related to level 3 body armor, and that number is 888-608-6605. That's 888-608-6605. And as we were talking about at the beginning of the hour, this amazing case out of Tennessee where just complaining about cloudy, bad-tasting water to the water board caused them to threaten the complainers with terrorism. Not just calling them loony, not just calling them conspiracy theorists, but threatening them and saying, you know, you better be careful. We might talk to Homeland Security about you. We might out you as a terrorist. Well, you may not be able to get the bureaucrats to do anything to clean up the water, but you can take control of it yourself to some degree. If you live in an area like we do here in Austin where they dump a lot of garbage into the water, fluoride and other things, you can get a ProPure filter. You can get that at InfoWarsStore.com. You can get 10% off. It's gravity filtration. It's the best way to purify your water. Unlike reverse osmosis or distillation, the ProPure filters don't eliminate the beneficial minerals that are found naturally in the water. Something you can do to help the operation and to take some control over your life, because there's only so much you can do to get these arrogant bureaucrats. You can't get them to stop spending massive amounts of money to take the waste from the aluminum and nuclear industry, the fluoride, and start dumping it into your water. Even if you believe that that is beneficial, and there's much, much science to show that it isn't, to show that it increases bone cancer and other illnesses, even if you believed that it was effective, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to mass medicate a population by putting stuff in the water supply. You're always going to get people that are under-medicated or over-medicated, even if it were effective, and it's not effective. But we were talking to Dr. William Pepper, and he's defended Sirhan Sirhan, trying to get him another trial, trying to get it reopened based on new evidence that surfaced in 2004 about audio recordings that showed that there were multiple guns and that there were 13 shots fired, and talking about how there was even physical evidence of these shots in the ceiling. It was upward shots, shot from behind, that actually killed Robert Kennedy. And Sirhan Sirhan was in front, and he was actually maintains that he did not know where he was. He didn't know that he had shot Robert Kennedy. He was told that he had, and believed it based on what he had been told. Sounds very similar to the shooting that we had in Aurora, Colorado. And there's a lot to be done in terms of educating the public as to what the CIA has been doing. We had some revelations of the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s where the CIA confessed to quite a bit of things that was news to the general public that had been talked about by other people. And we know that for at least 60 years, the government has been making a science out of mind control. That's something that the general public just doesn't understand yet. And we have a documentary that's coming out that you can pre-book right now at InfoWarsStore.com, Mind Control. It's about the psychology of mind control and what's been done in these programs over the last several decades. Dr. Pepper, we were just talking about the new trial that you're getting involved in. Tell us a little bit about that, and we've got a couple of more minutes. Tell us where you want to try to take that. You said you're trying to get that case reopened and actually, I guess, trying to do a prosecution based on the evidence that you've got there. Is that correct?
Well, I think we're exploring all of the possible avenues. The whole idea is to get a judicial setting, whether it's civil or criminal, where the evidence that Peter Janney has dug up and others have dug up as well,
well, that's good. We're gonna talk to you. We're gonna have an interview on the Prisonplanet.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Radio Show. I'm not Alex Jones. I'm Jakari Jackson for the InfoWars Nightly News. Definitely want to thank David Knight for filling in for the first 2 hours. Alex is out on location shooting an assignment with Rob Dew, and he'll be back next week. And we'll also have Paul Joseph Watson joining us for the remainder of the hour right after this break. Now, also in this hour, we're going to premiere Alex's video about Superman, the review of Superman, and also, I guess, what you would call a preview of World War Z. Now, I'm pretty sure many people are familiar with the Superman film, but for World War Z, those who are not familiar, it's a zombie movie. And it's about how great the UN is and how bad the rest of us are. You know, if you're one of the elites, one of the elect, you can go off to the aircraft carriers or whatever when the zombie plague comes. But if you're just a normal person trying to live your everyday life when the zombie invasion comes, that's it for you. And I haven't had a chance to see the film myself. I believe David Knight had a chance to watch it last night. But I have seen Superman, and I'll talk about that a little bit in preview before Watson joins us in the next few minutes. I went out and saw Superman this past week, and it was a very interesting film. You know, I'm a big comic book guy, so I may have some critiques about it that other people don't get. But by and large, I thought it was a very good family-friendly film. You know, if you have maybe about a 12 or 13-year-old, it's probably very appropriate for them. It's not as near as dark as the Batman movies, so it's I think it's good for the whole family by and large. There's a lot of criticism about the film as far as religious aspects of it, and I will admit it does have a very heavy Christian tone to it. There's even one point, this isn't a big spoiler, but there's even one point in the film where Superman actually goes to church. So I guess some people were offended by that or, had whatever feelings about that. But it's a good, positive movie, but it does talk about things such as eugenics, drones, a lot of other things that I thought were pretty interesting. It was a very entertaining film. Had time on Krypton and all that. So it's a very special effects heavy film, very interesting. If you're like me and you were turned off by the last Superman movie because there was really no action or anything to that effect, it's very entertaining. They punch people through walls and big explosions and all that good stuff. So I thought it was a very entertaining film. And people ask, why do you guys talk about movies like Superman? Why do you talk about video games? It's because it's propaganda. It can be conditioning, or it could be, in some cases, a warning. And various people have their opinions about this or that. But, the last video game review I did was for a video game called Rainbow Six Patriots. And this is a game that's going to come out on the next generation consoles, Xbox One, and also PlayStation 4. And this is a video game about how a special operations group called the Rainbow Six go out and they tackle the terrorist. And this particular threat happens to be patriots, domestic terrorists, as I guess they call them in this new video game. The Rainbow Six is it's a long line of video games. I'm not exactly sure how many they have in the series, but this isn't their first rodeo. And they chose to choose a domestic threat, saying that people who are upset about banker bailouts, people who may be associated in activism groups such as Occupy Wall Street and things like that, they may just have a screw loose. And actually the trailer, we're not going to play it right here because our time is short, but in the trailer you can see these guys, they walk in, they say, I could skin a buck, I could run a trout line, and I'll kill your wife if you don't do exactly what I say. And they strap this guy up with a bomb. And then the hero, Rainbow Six, they come in, they're shooting police and throwing hostages off bridges and stuff. And I'm not making this stuff up. And, you know, people have said that they're very unhappy with Ubisoft, the game's publisher, and have gone to their Facebook page. And if you go to the Ubisoft Facebook page, you can see it right there. Half the comments are just negative comments about Rainbow Six. And Ubisoft makes many more games than Rainbow Six, but people's like, I'm not buying Ubisoft games anymore. I'm tired of you guys with all this propaganda, pushing this in our face, saying that patriots are bad. People who support the Second Amendment are bad. And it's not just, you know, Rainbow Six. We also see this in a lot of the TV shows and movies and other things such as that. Alex and I did a report a little bit back called Hollywood Hates Militiamen, and we should document how they're demonizing militia groups and so forth. People who just care about their country. If you know the Constitution, if you can quote the Constitution, you're some evil sovereign citizen. We've seen that on 60 Minutes and so forth. But our break is coming up, and I do believe we'll have Paul Joseph Watson with us right after this break, so stay tuned. The NSA is. You got that right. The NSA is always watching. They had it right. How old is that song? Does anybody know? Well, they knew way back then that people were tapping your phones in mid-'80s. Okay, so before the whole internet craze, but they were watching you back then and have even more of a dragnet on you now. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Radio Show. I'm Jakari Jackson filling in. I want to thank David Knight, of course, for doing the first 2 hours. And now we're going to go to Paul Joseph Watson, who's going to take us out for the rest of the show. Paul?
Hi, Jakari. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, we're talking about the death of Michael Hastings, the Rolling Stone journalist. Now, as you know, we often get accused of saying that everything's a conspiracy theory. I don't involve myself in that. I think that certain events are accidents or genuinely organic events. An example would be the Woolwich attack last month. I put out a YouTube video which ended up getting 500,000 viewers, basically saying that, yes, this was a real event. It wasn't staged by crisis actors. And we got a lot of heat for that. But now this incident involving Michael Hastings, the Rolling Stone journalist, certainly has a lot of suspicion attached to it with new developments today. So if you want to introduce, what happened, then we can get into the evidence.
Since he was a Rolling Stones writer, he was allegedly driving down the street in his Mercedes-Benz at a high rate of speed. The story says he allegedly struck a tree and the car burst into flames. Now, I'm very interested in hearing from Mercedes as to whether or not their car spontaneously combust. I'd love to hear them, retort that statement. But if you watch the videos or see the pictures, you'll see that most of the damage done to the vehicle appears to be done to the back. You can see it right there if you're watching on Prisonplanet.tv, and also has some hefty damage to the front. But why is the back end so heavily damaged if he struck a tree head on? That's the question that many people are asking. There's speculations that there may have been a bomb planted in the vehicle, speculations maybe even a drone took him out. Like I said, I can't vet that one way or the other. But he had also made some very powerful enemies. One, McChrystal, as well as many other high-ranking officials, just didn't like this guy. And he also said himself, Hastings said, when you go against these dudes, just a paraphrase, he said, when you go against these dudes, a lot of them want you dead.
Precisely, and that's what he was most known for, was the 2010 Rolling Stone expose of General Stanley McChrystal, where he basically exposed the fact that the top generals in the military were being denigratory towards the Obama administration. They were having bickering between the two. And that ended up, obviously, in General McChrystal being fired and replaced with Petraeus. According to LA Weekly, Hastings was also working on an expose of the CIA in the weeks before his death. And we also found out that he contacted a WikiLeaks lawyer in the very hours before the quote accident.
That's right.
Fearing the fact that he was being investigated by the FBI, which the FBI came out today and denied that they had any dealings with him, despite the fact that his body was only identified yesterday as a result of the coroner in Los Angeles matching the fingerprints with those held on file by the FBI.
And we know the FBI never lies, Paul, because they had a situation with the Tamerlan associate, the boxer, the MMA fighter, and they go and talk to this guy, and first the guy lunged at him and because he had a knife, and then he didn't have a knife, and they just started shooting, and he ended up dead. So we know that they never falsify any statements.
Well, exactly. I mean, that carried on for about a week, didn't it? This guy was shot 6 times in the head, Todashev. He was obviously a friend with one of the accused Boston bombers. For about almost a week, if I recall, the FBI was saying he had a weapon, he lunged at them, it was self-defense on behalf of the agents. Later had to admit that was complete baloney. He didn't have a weapon, he didn't lunge at anyone. And that investigation seems to have just tailed off into nothing.
And he also told his friend that he didn't want his friend to leave because he was in fear for his life.
Precisely. And there's also this new report about the FBI which came out yesterday. They investigated themselves basically in incidents of FBI shooting other people involved in cases over the last 20 years, since 1993. And in 150 incidents of people being shot by the FBI, I believe it was 80 killed, 70 injured. The FBI said that there was no wrongdoing in any of those 150 cases, despite the fact that one was known to be somebody they mistook for a bank robber. They shot and I believe injured him. He won in court. He got a settlement, and still the FBI cleared themselves and said that that wasn't a case of wrongdoing in FBI agents shooting other people. In every single case, 150 people shot over the last 20 years, the FBI says no wrongdoing. So based on that evidence, can you really trust them that they had no involvement with Hastings, even though they identified his fingerprints from the body as a result of matching them with FBI prints of Hastings that they had on record? So they must have had some dealings with him, but now they come out today and say, we had nothing to do with it, despite the fact that Hastings, in the hours before his death, contacted this WikiLeaks lawyer and said they were investigating me.
Exactly. And, reports are still coming in. I'm interested in what the eyewitnesses have to say. They say they heard, some say they saw, some said they heard an explosion go off, and then, the engine is flying down the street and so forth. And I think about, when you watch a NASCAR race or so forth, and you see these horrendous wrecks, there's a lot of shrapnel and so forth, but I don't recall ever seeing an engine fly down the raceway.
Well, here's the thing. This is what strikes me about it, and I'm not a technical expert in any of this, but this is what a lot of the people on all the car websites, all the vehicle experts are saying. The engine and the transmission from the vehicle was found, this is public knowledge now, it was found, and we've got pictures of it, 100 feet away from the scene of the crash, the supposed crash up against the tree. So the engine flies out 100 feet away, and that's not suspicious. They also had a white sheet. If you look at some of the pictures, they've put a white sheet over the front of the vehicle. For whatever reason, I don't know. Some people are claiming the front of the vehicle's basically entirely missing, which is not consistent with a crash. It's more consistent with some kind of incendiary device. And even those who are calling us, calling the questioning of his death a trutherism in that pejorative debunking term, even they're saying that certain aspects of this are suspicious, and to not ask questions about it in light of the fact that we know he had made numerous enemies in high places, CIA, FBI, the military generals, it would be completely remiss not to ask questions about it. And then on top of that, his colleagues all said he was paranoid, he was freaked out, he was a nervous wreck in the days before this happened. This is a quote, he was incredibly tense and very worried and was concerned that the government was looking in on his material, said one of his colleagues. Also, his editor at BuzzFeed, Ben Smith, said that Hastings had told his family and friends, quote, he was concerned that he was under investigation. And then another friend of Hastings said, He was very paranoid that he was being watched by the FBI. So all his friends are saying he's paranoid, he's a nervous wreck. We know he was also very concerned about the AP wiretapping scandal of journalists. He believed he was a target. He was doing stories on the CIA. He was doing a story on the FBI in relation to the Petraeus scandal. And he winds up dead after his Mercedes, which is one of the safest cars in the world, basically a brand new model, appears to explode into flames after hitting a tree. Then you look at some of the pictures, there's very little damage to the tree, and the actual crash seems more consistent with the vehicle having some kind of incendiary device planted in it rather than just a straightforward crash. That's not what I'm saying. That's what a lot of the experts on these vehicle websites have said about it. So you tie it in with the fact that he was a known enemy of the establishment. He had all these blockbusters apparently coming up, about to be released. As you said earlier, Jakari, he had received death threats from staffers linked to McChrystal. They said, we're going to come after you, we're going to kill you. He also received death threats from other people, which is documented in his book. You've got the death threats, he's a nervous wreck before, he's paranoid, apparently under investigation by the FBI, getting ready to release all these stories.
Exactly. Now, Paul, I want to chime in on one thing that you said that's very important. We talked about the tarp over the vehicle. Why would they need a tarp to cover up this vehicle? I think about a similar situation on 9/11 at the Pentagon when they were taking, I guess, shrapnel or whatever else out of the Pentagon, and they brought out this big blue tarp to cover up whatever they were bringing out. Like, why do you need to cover that up? And not even talking about the Pentagon, but talking about a car wreck. I've never seen a car wreck where they covered up anything beside the body of the victim.
Well, that's what my first thought was. Maybe they're covering it up to hide the charred body of the victim. But if you look, it's, you could just look in the passenger window and see the victim. So that can't be the reason for it. The reports that I've read state that the police arrived on the scene almost immediately, which in, these days of austerity and cutbacks, you rarely see that. It takes them at least 10, 15 minutes. So they were on the scene immediately. This white tarp gets thrown over the vehicle, and then you've got all the questions about the damage to the vehicle. There appears to be, the front of the car appears to be completely missing in a couple of photos, which suggests that's why they put the tarp on for whatever reason, I don't know. So there are a lot of questions about it. There's a lot of motive behind it. That's the thing. If you take the example of Woolwich, which I said was a natural incident, wasn't staged according to the evidence, there seemingly was no motive to stage that incident. But in the death of Hastings, there's motive on behalf of a ton of different people linked to, the highest positions of power, CIA, FBI, Department of Justice.
Okay, Paul, hold that thought. We have to go to break. And Paul's bringing up a very good point. We'll talk about all that. We'll talk about the FBI and their drones. They say, yeah, we have drones, but we don't use them all that much. We'll talk about all that right on the other side. I like Johnny Cash. It reminds me of that debate. I think it's a GOP debate, and they asked Michelle Bachmann, do you like Johnny Cash? Do you like Elvis better? And she's like, I was like, you can't answer that simple question if you like Johnny Cash or Elvis. I like Johnny Cash, but each his own. Now, before we go back to Paul Joseph Watson, I'm Jakari Jackson, filling in for Alex Jones. Myself and Paul are going to be hosting for the remainder of the show. Go to the InfoWars shop and pick up this State of Mind, the DVD, and also the Blu-ray. Available. It's a great film about mind control, about many things. Alex is in it, and many other people are in it. I believe we're selling that exclusively at the InfoWars shop, so definitely go and pick yours up today. Now, before we go back to Paul Joseph Watson, I have this article right here that we were referencing, talking about the FBI. The FBI has received aviation clearance for at least 4 domestic drone operations, and it goes on to have the quote from Mueller, where he says, we very, very rarely use these things in a minimal way and very seldom and very few and all these very small accounts, according to him. So, Paul, you were also talking about the FBI, so go ahead and finish your thought on that.
Yeah, well, with regard to the drones, they're trying to sell this myth that it's, just a few occasions they've used them. For years, the Department of Homeland Security has been pouring millions of dollars into local police departments to develop domestic drone programs for, quote, public safety. If you go to an article I wrote back in February, DHS advances plan for public safety drones. This documents how their program, Robotic Aircraft for Public Safety, has been ongoing for years. Police departments get anything from $250,000 to $500,000 every time they launch one of these domestic drone programs. So it's already been underway domestically for years under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security. And the FBI is no different. Of course, you had the video which we put out from the Shadowhawk drone, which is this 50-pound mini helicopter, again funded by the DHS. Police departments across America are buying it with the aid of DHS funding. And the promotional video for that drone shows it spying on a, quote, illegal gun sale. So they're planning to use these things for illegal gun sales in the US, according to their own promotional propaganda. So the fact that domestic drones have been on the agenda, you know, the FAA says, 30,000 drones in American skies within the next 10 years. It's already been happening for years. And I think one of the most popular misconceptions about drones is that they will be these huge predator type things. They won't. In 5 to 10 years, they're going to have insect drones. They're already developing them under DARPA and other different agencies. Insect-sized drones that are going to whiz around your backyard and spy on you. So it's not going to be very visible, but it's going to be plentiful because they're going to get them down to a smaller and smaller size.
And also we see them, not just the insect drones, but, you know, one of the, I guess, retail types that you can go to a surveillance store, not just a surveillance store, but a electronics store and purchase. You can rig these things up with cameras. We've also seen, you can go on YouTube and watch FPS Russia shoot one of those little drones, and it has a gun attached to it. I mean, these things are very real, very feasible, especially as technology advances and these things become more readily available.
Oh, certainly. The Shadowhawk drone that I mentioned has the capability for a 12-gauge shotgun to be attached, as well as a taser device. So they're going to have them for surveillance. They're going to have them weaponized. And, you know, we're going to be living in a they live type scenario. But even the makers of the drones, like David Cenciotti, who helped develop some of these swarm drones that work together, have openly said they're going to be used for homeland security purposes, hunting terrorists, you know, who the DHS identifies as terrorists. So the scope of this is all going domestic over the next few years. And it's kind of like the NSA revelation with the FBI revelation about the drones. We already knew it was happening, and now suddenly everybody is concerned about it. We've been concerned about it for years.
Exactly. And just like you alluded to, the new domestic threat, the terrorists, the Tea Parties, the guys with the gats and flags and skin bucks and run trot lines. But Paul, our time is short. In this segment, we'll come back on the next break, and you can tell us about Kurzweil and transhumanists. I know you have a lot of that coming up. But before we do that, just want to remind everybody, State of Mind at InfoWarsShop.com. It also comes with a free American Dream. This is a great animated film. If you have about a 13-year-old, it's probably fine for them. But it goes over the history of the Federal Reserve, but also get the State of Mind at InfoWars Shop. It's a great film. It's a great thing for you and your family. Alex is in it. Many other great people are in it. And it's just one of the great products you can get at InfoWarsShop.com. And like I said, Alex will be back Sunday on the radio show. He's out on location right now with Rob Booth, so they're bringing you more special reports, more things. This is what your money and stuff goes to when you support the InfoWar, when you go to prisonplanet.tv, and also InfoWars Nightly News tonight at 7 p.m.
We're on the march.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Radio Show. Jakari Jackson and Paul Joseph Watson filling in. Now, before we go back to Paul, we have this clip we'd like to premiere here on the radio. This is Alex Jones's breakdown of the new Superman movie and also World War Z.
Chris Nolan and David Goyer, that brought us the blockbuster Dark Knight trilogy, have now put out The Man of Steel. They are throwing in your face the memes that the global elite are actually obsessed with. Genetic engineering, eugenics, world government, terraforming, it's all there. And I'm going to break down the dichotomy between the messages in Superman, the Man of Steel, and World War Z with Brad Pitt. The director and the writers of The Dark Knight, especially in the third installment, put out deep French Revolution, Illuminati, Jacobin ideology. For someone that has researched this information, it was a very disturbing film and shows that the writers and the director have a deep knowledge of what's going on in secret societies. And that's why it's so shocking to go see The Man of Steel, which is undoubtedly the best comic book adaptation to film I've ever seen, and had about a 98% rating towards pro-liberty. There are very few things that are pro-globalist, anti-human propaganda in the film. My main criticism is it shows the FBI paramilitary pointing guns at Lois Lane in her face as if she's a threat and done something wrong, and basically kidnapping her. So it does promote the police state. But other than that, from A to Z, this film is a revolution against the goals of the globalist. Another criticism that some students of esoteric knowledge can bring forth is that it is a pro-Antichrist film, though I disagree with that view. You have the God-man who falls from the stars to earth. He is 33 years old when he's forced to go public to save humanity. In the original 1933 writing, he's clearly a Christ figure whose father is named Joseph and whose mother is named Mary. And the makers of this new film and the writers admit that he is a Christ figure. But I wouldn't call him an anti-Christ figure because he supports free will and he supports the general humanity. Whereas the true Antichrist figure, I would say, is more represented by General Zod. General Zod, though, believes that he should control creation and wants to terraform an already living planet to re-engineer it, to recreate Krypton here on Earth. Jor-El, Superman's father, represents the archetypal Renaissance figure of renewal or expansion and liberty, who is blocked by the Krypton Council and other corrupt forces from trying to save his species. So the film also points out that the ruling elite is stagnant and corrupt and is not infallible and is the greatest threat to humanity. Jor-El also criticizes the genetic engineering of the species into specialized eugenics-based groups instead of allowing natural development of the species. Let me introduce the Paul Revere scale now that we're going to begin using in Infowars.com movie reviews. The more horses, the more pro-liberty, pro-human empowerment the film is. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give Superman, Man of Steel, 9 horses. There are literally hundreds of deep archetypal messages in this film. And regardless of what you think about it, it is deep on many, many levels. Superman, and this is a spoiler alert, at the end takes out a Predator drone that is spying on him and explains that it's wrong to violate people's privacy. There's a lot of pro-liberty messages. Also, as a child, he has X-ray vision, so he sees people's beating hearts, their skeletons. And that's a metaphor or an allegory of people that are very in-tuned and intelligent who are actually driven mad by how complex reality is. And it's an allegory of the burden of the highly intelligent who are not predatory and who don't decide to use their advanced intelligence to suppress and dominate the rest of humanity. Overall, it's an anti-centralization message. It's an anti-military industrial complex message. It's an anti-eugenics message. It's an anti-stagnant, inbred, monopoly elite message. The message is we must have a renaissance and reach for the stars. And overall, it is one of the most positive films I've seen in a long time. And it follows a rebellion in Hollywood that I have been basically informed of from multiple high-level sources over the last few years, that they're tired of the left-right paradigm, that you're either a liberal, socialist, communist, anti-gun person, or you're allowed to be kind of a neocon, warmonger, conservative. The people are voting with their dollars, voting with their eyes, with what they watch, and we are forcing more and more wholesome messages to come out, like Ed Asner in the movie Up, like Oblivion. I'm not even a Tom Cruise fan, but that message is anti-tyranny, anti-technocracy, anti-compartmentalization. And there's more and more of these films coming out, like Elysium, that is absolutely exposing the robotic technocracy. Now let's look at World War Z. I was able to get some of the early scripts about 6 months ago. We also have the book, which I've read, World War Z. And now they've gone into multiple rewrites and reshoots. So as the film prepares to come out, we are not 100% exactly what's in it. But we do have the earlier versions, and they're very similar to the book, which is an anti-human, pro-elite, pro-mass extermination manifesto that I can only describe as ultra-Hitlerian. They say in the book and in earlier versions of the film that there's nothing worse than American militias and gun owners. And thank God the zombie apocalypse happened, because at least it reduced the numbers of humans worldwide and allowed the UN to invade America and put gun owners and families in concentration camps. They praise communism in the book and in the earlier screenplays. It is a piece of authoritarian pornography. And despite the fact it has a mega budget and Brad Pitt is behind it, I predict this film will not perform as good as other films that have more wholesome messages. People are sick of the psychic poison. The globalists want to turn off our life force, turn off our self-preservation instinct. They want to teach us it's sexy and cool to be anti-human. And in the book and the earlier screenplays, they talk about how being cold-blooded and exterminating masses of people and feeding families to the zombies was the smart thing to do, and how the United Nations used the crisis to bring in their global government and finally crush right-wing libertarians in America. And then you look at the big mega banks that control the world and are setting up global taxation and who are above the law and exempt through the UN and have diplomatic immunity. This is what they're promoting. There's going to be a worldwide biological release that reduces world population and that the UN will manage the globe during this crisis. This is all basically a Jim Jones Kool-Aid drinking drill. Jim Jones had his followers in Guyana hundreds of times drill drinking the Kool-Aid until finally they put the cyanide in it and everybody poisoned themselves. And that's what this is. Just get ready for a major collapse. And those of you that work for the Technocracy, who are specialists like the Brad Pitt character, you'll get to go be on the ships safe from the bioweapon release. You'll get to go to the underground bases during the mass calamity and collapse that is coming. And then I researched their underground seed banks, their martial law plans. They're actually gearing up for something like this. And they've got all these scientists and top police and military signed on to believing they're going to be protected during all this. I have not seen it yet. It's coming out tomorrow. But I've read the book, seen the early screenplays. I would have to give it 0 Paul Revere's as an anti-human treatise, selling the zombies as the liberators of humanity, selling the image of humanity as a bunch of walking dead. Thoroughly disgusting. So I give World War Z 0 Paul Revere's. So World War Z is a dress rehearsal for worldwide planetary genocide and a re-engineering of our planet. They're selling General Zod's takeover as a good thing in World War Z. And so that's why I hope that World War Z is a failure and that positive films like Oblivion and Man of Steel and Up and so many others become the norm. Because there's a fight for the heart and soul of Hollywood right now. And regardless of what you think about Hollywood, it is the worldwide propaganda channel of the globalist. And you're seeing a spiritual fight, a cultural fight for the future of humanity taking place right now. I'm Alex Jones with Infowars.com. This is another film review. Superman, the Man of Steel versus World War Z, only at Infowars.com.
All right, and there was the review for World War Z versus the Man of Steel. And I haven't seen World War Z. It just came out, but I'm pretty sure Superman's going to be a lot better. Paul, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Have you had a chance to see either one of the films?
I'm actually going to see the Superman film tomorrow morning, so I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, now, Paul, I know you had a lot of different things that you want to talk about, and I don't want to spoil the movie for you, but Alex already said it, so there is a eugenics aspect to the film where they have planned births and so forth. So it's all the propaganda coming in there, you know, and guys like Goyer, who wrote, I guess, co-wrote Superman. He also wrote, or at least co-wrote The Dark Knight, the Batman movies, and also the video game Black Ops. So the guys are definitely well-informed, well-involved in what's going on in the world.
Well, precisely. I mean, they're on the cutting edge, aren't they? Alex also mentioned the film Elysium, which is, you know, the upcoming dystopic Matt Damon film. And in that, humanity separates into two new class systems. Those who get the cybernetic upgrades, they go and live on an off-planet habitat. And then the rest of humanity is consigned to a dying Earth, you know, overpopulated, lack of food, lack of sanitation. So this theme runs through a lot of Hollywood blockbusters at the moment because it's also on the cutting edge of science with, you know, people like Ray Kurzweil talking about it, which we can move on to now.
Sure.
Well, there was this Global Futures 2045 conference last weekend in New York. Ray Kurzweil, who of course is an inventor futurist, we spoke about him on the show many times before, he gave another speech in which he basically re-outlined what he first set forth in his book, The Age of Spiritual Machines. Now, for people who haven't read the book, it was written in 1999. He basically predicted almost every technological development from 1999 to 2009. The iPod, Netflix, the Kindle, everything that we now use and take for granted, which was unheard of in 1999, he predicted it. So he's got a quite accurate track record, which is interesting because by 2029, if you read his book, he predicts that humans will have cybernetically augmented their bodies. They're going to have brain interfaces, chips, augmentations that allow them to be smarter, have greater memories, be more immune from disease and so on. But what Kurzweil doesn't admit in his speeches, such as the one that happened last weekend, is the fact that this kind of technology is not going to be available for all of us. It's going to be available for a super elite that uses it to dominate and enslave the rest of the population. And he actually admits it in his own book. Here's a quote. People involved in unskilled labor will become superfluous when their jobs are replaced by machines, and there is almost no human employment in production, agriculture, and transportation. So the machines are going to come in to replace the workers, the unskilled labor. And then people who either refuse or are incapable of getting the cybernetic implants, the cyborg upgrades, this is what he said about them. Quote, humans who do not utilize such implants are unable to meaningfully participate in dialogues with those who do. So he's basically saying, if you don't get the brain chip, if you don't get the cybernetic upgrade, which is going to be consigned to the elite because most of us won't be able to afford it,
right,
or if we reject it and, you know, get called neo-Luddites, then we're not going to be meaningfully engaged in society. We're not going to be able to have dialogues with other people, which is kind of like what the modern cell phone is. If you don't have a cell phone, then you're seen as somehow backward and you can't communicate with people. It's going to be that to an even greater level, but I think more people will resist the cybernetic implants, the upgrades, and it's going to create this clash of two classes where the elite goes off and has all these upgrades, life extension technologies, while the rest of us are left to suffer in, you know, the cry freedom ghetto, as it once was described.
And we see this not just to interrupt you briefly, Paul, and we get back to Kurzweil, but we see this recently with the Xbox, I don't want to call it a scandal, but the Xbox One, the next generation, where they said that they were going to have it plugged into the internet 24 hours a day, and it had the retina scanning. The thing was so advanced it could tell if you were enjoying the game. And we had one of the publishers, I believe it was, for one of the game companies, came out and he said, well, if you don't like your Xbox being on 24 hours a day and all your information being gathered, well, you can just stay with an Xbox 360. And enough people said, well, we'll just stay with the Xbox 360. Then Microsoft came and was like, no, to go out and buy the Xbox One. So we see when people rise up and they say, we don't want this technology that can actually have a meaningful impact.
Well, precisely. I mean, you don't have to go along with it. What they're trying to bring in is the Internet of Things, where slavery is sold as convenience. I mean, this is what Petraeus talked about when he said, you know, it's the new cutting edge of clandestine statecraft. They don't need to wiretap anyone if every device in your home is on the internet, is sending messages about you, is recording you, as with the Xbox.
Exactly. No, I didn't mean to interrupt, Paul. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and that's basically what this is all heading towards, is being even more plugged into the matrix. And those who aren't are ostracized from society. I mean, you read the book and it's quite frankly bizarre. By the end of the book, one of the characters in it who he has a dialogue with has merged with her computer hive mind lover and is having sex with herself in virtual reality.
This is in Kurzweil's book?
That he envisages.
That's in Spiritual Machines?
Yeah, it's crazy.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's absolutely crazy. She dumps this character, Molly, dumps her husband and actually goes off and fornicates with this computer hive mind. And then by the end of the book, Kurzweil wants to get in on the fun as well. So this is a very disturbed mind.
There was a real story about I guess they do this in Japan, where you can marry like a video game character or like a cartoon character. And there's this guy, he married a cartoon character and he had it on his little iPhone or whatever he was. He's like, yeah, this is my wife, Susie, and I don't know how they fornicate, or I guess they're married so they don't fornicate. But we'll talk about all that and a whole lot more on the other side with Paul Joseph Watson. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Radio Show. Jakari Jackson and Paul Joseph Watson filling in. Now, Paul, I know you have a lot of information to go about, and this is the last segment, so I'm just going to step back, give you the reins, and go over all your information.
Well, yeah, we were talking about Ray Kurzweil and his recent prediction, again, that by 2045, humans will upload their minds into computers, and then in the decades following, we will basically dispense with the body altogether. We will become virtual reality avatars. Basically, to me, that means a complete spiritual holocaust. You can't survive, the spirit can't survive in a computer program. But that's what he's predicting, and he's been very accurate with his past predictions. As I said before the break, I would question his sanity by the fact that he has a dialogue with this character called Molly in his book, who is living through the different time periods which he forecasts up to 2099. And by the end of it, Molly has dumped her husband. She's merged with a hive mind computer program called George. She has virtual reality sex with this computer program. And basically, the original Molly, her body has been dispensed with. They all merge together. And then by the end of it, Kurzweil himself gets in on the act. It's completely bizarre, but people give this guy credence because he's had accurate predictions. What's frightening about it is those humans who resist this cybernetic upgrade, this merging into the matrix, becoming a virtual reality avatar, uploading your mind to a computer. And remember, Kurzweil is one of the key directors at Google. This is not some ranting lunatic. He's got a position of power now. They quote, in this book, Kurzweil quotes Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And he's also quoted by Bill Joy in the Wired magazine article, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. And they give him credence despite the fact that he was a terrorist, because he outlined succinctly the dangers posed by this future that Kurzweil and others are predicting. And this is the quote: due to improved techniques, the elite will have greater control over the masses, and because human work will no longer be necessary, the masses will be superfluous, a useless burden on the system. If the elite is ruthless, they may simply decide to exterminate the mass of humanity. If they are humane, they may use propaganda or other psychological or biological techniques to reduce the birth rate until the mass of humanity becomes extinct, leaving the world to the elite. That's what Ted Kaczynski wrote. That's what Kurzweil quotes in his own book as either one of those two likely outcomes as a result of this new class system being created by the elite having access to the life extension technologies, the cybernetic upgrades. So they're basically saying, once the elite are in that position of total technological dominance, We will be superfluous if we don't adopt the same thing. It will be kept from us to begin with. Most people won't be able to do it. So we'll either be sterilized and go out of existence, or they'll just slaughter us straight off the bat. So that's what the futurists are predicting for humanity. I, for one, have no interest in seeing that as the future of the human race, but a lot of influential elitist futurists like Ray Kurzweil do.
Yeah, it's a very scary thing. It's a very creepy thing. You know, it reminds me of that statue you guys saw at Bilderberg, that weird half Terminator-looking thing climbing out of the ooze, and that's really what they want. And it sounds so sci-fi to anybody, you know, who's new to this information, but this is very much what they want. Briefly, Paul, give me your thoughts on Google Glass.
Well, again, Google Glass was predicted by Kurzweil in this book in 1999. Eventually, obviously, it's going to be embedded in the eye. It's going to be a contact lens as well. But that is part of this transhumanist move towards cybernetic upgrades. The good news is that businesses across America are already banning it because it's basically
Paul.
a wiretap
Paul, we're
system.
close to the end, but I do agree with you on that. InfoWars Nightly News tonight, 7 p.m. Central. I'll be hosting. Gigi Arnetta will be in studio with me.